Science Beetle.
Hey, welcome back, students. In this lesson, I want to focus on the classification of matter. Now, up to now, what we've done is we've had a lot of discussion about matter. We've talked about how matter has mass, it takes up space. We also talked about how matter has different phases to it, either the solid, the liquid, or the gas. We also talked about the various properties of matter, being the extensive or the intensive properties. And within the intensive properties, we also talked about the chemical and the physical properties that are associated with it. What I want to do today is kind of give you a little bit more of a general way of how we kind of group matter together, which is what classification of matter really is. A general way to kind of bring up a visual in terms of the grouping is kind of to think of the grouping almost kind of like what happens when you put a fluid in a funnel. And obviously this is a little bit of a funky funnel, but essentially what's going to happen here is that as you make your way down, eventually you're going to get to a certain point, right? But at the very top, you begin with a very general amount, and that amount then gets kind of filtered down a little bit further, and the spacing becomes smaller and smaller as you move your way down, right? And eventually you see the little pieces are very small, so that eventually you come up with this little piece right here, which is going to be the smallest grouping, right? And so in many respects, when we group matter, we want to go ahead and divide it and subdivide it even further until we get down to the smallest grouping or the smallest part. In a previous lesson, we talked about how you can take matter and eventually the smallest part is going to be the atom. But essentially what we're doing here is going to be the general categories that we can divide matter into. And there's 4 of them. And let's see how we can get to those 4 here in this lesson. The easiest way to kind of get at this is if you take matter that's in your environment right now and you start to ask, look at it and essentially ask if it can be separated into different parts, right? So that would be the first step. You know, can it be separated? And you get 2 general answers. If the answer is yes, essentially what you've got here is that this particular one is going to have some parts to it, right? And so we got to figure that out. And what we would generally call this is we would call this a mixture, right? And so mixtures are going to be a blend of 2 or more kinds of matter. And each of those parts of the matter still retain its own different properties. If the matter that you're looking at cannot be separated, what we call this right here, we essentially say that it's pure. Now remember that discussion that we had previously where we looked at matter and we looked at the atoms of oxygen, hydrogen, and chlorine. And just to remind us here, let me go ahead and draw it. Remember the drawing that I put? So I put oxygen inside the container. And all I had there was oxygen atoms, and we called this pure. Why? Because all of the particular particles on the inside were identical. Remember that? And so what we're talking about here is that in the grouping of matter at this level is if it cannot be separated at all, then obviously what you've got here is going to be particles that are the same. But what we have to consider when we talk about a pure substance is when we say pure, are we talking about single particles or atoms, or are we talking about molecules? Or rather, let me write it this other way. Are we talking about groups of particles? Because if we're talking about groups of particles, what we really call this is going to be compounds. And if we're talking about single particles here, what we're talking about here are the elements. Okay? And coming back over here on the other side, if we have a mixture, the thing about the mixture is we're going to ask ourselves several questions about that mixture. Is the mixture going to be that we really can't tell the difference between the different parts inside? And if we can't tell the difference, then how do we know what's inside, right? But if we can tell the difference, then obviously we know that there's some separation going on. and that's going to be a mix of items inside that mixture. And so the next step that we want to ask here in terms of the mixture is we want to ask ourselves, or ask the question about what is the composition? And so let me write that as a question here, question, and let me go ahead and write that. And so the question we're asking is the composition uniform? In other words, is the composition of the matter that we're looking at the same throughout the matter, or are there different sections of the matter that are very observable? If the answer is yes, if it's uniform, essentially what we've got here is we're going to have a mixture in which you cannot differentiate between one part and the other part, and essentially what you've got here is you've got a homogeneous mixture. And if you cannot, if it's not uniform, essentially what you've got here is a heterogeneous mixture. And let me explain that very briefly. A homogeneous mixture would be if you take alcohol and water and you mix them together. You're not going to be able to tell which of the molecules are from water and which of the molecules are from alcohol. And so that would be the homogeneous mixture. A heterogeneous mixture would be if you take water and you mix clay with it. When you shake it up and mix it up, you're going to be able to tell, after, especially if you let it settle, you're going to see that some of the homogeneous mixture is going to turn back into water, and you're going to be see a separation where the clay particles are then going to start to settle at the bottom. So you definitely can see the different parts, and that would be a heterogeneous or heterogeneous mixture. When we look at the pure substances on the other side, then, the elements can no longer be divided. Those are the simple divisions there. But the group of elements, group of particles, then, those are compounds. And those could be divided even further into its respective elements. But essentially, if you follow me here, you've got the 4 different types of groupings. Homogeneous mixtures, heterogeneous mixtures, elements, and compounds. And so when we're classifying matter, these are the 4 classification groups that we're really talking about. So I think up to now, if you've gotten most of the information that we've talked about up through this lesson, I think you're ready to head on to the next lesson and talk about the elements and the atoms and see how that discussion develops. All right, so go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.